Just a couple of minutes to get on and then we will start.
Hey, Crockett.
All right, well, we will go ahead and get started, and people can still filter in as I'm doing the intro. Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. This is our second to last installment of the Election 2020 Lunch and Learn series. I can hardly believe that we're already here and that we are just a week away from the election. My name is Emily Sears. I am the Civic Engagement Fellow for Queen's University of Charlotte. And if you have questions during the presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat box and I will facilitate asking those towards the end of Dr. Commons' presentation. And if you want to reference this webinar again, we will have a recording of it posted on our website that Jen will link in the chat. And be sure to follow us on Instagram at QU_votes for updates and fun things that we have been doing and will continue to do all the way past the election. So, without further ado, Dr. Maggie Commons is the Shelton Professor of Political Science at Queen's University of Charlotte. She teaches courses in Latin American politics, U.S.-Latin American relations, international political economy, and immigration policy. I've taken most of these, and they are phenomenal classes. She is also the recipient of Queen's 2020 Hunter Hamilton Love of Teaching Award. Dr. Commons' research interests include U.S. immigration policy, U.S. policy toward Latin America, civically engaged research, and the scholarship of teaching and learning. She considers herself a public scholar and enjoys contributing to public discourse through community discussions on campus in Charlotte and even in Guatemala, where she's given several public lectures on U.S. immigration policy. She believes strongly in the importance of civil discourse and community engagement. So thank you, Dr. Commons, for being with us today, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Emily. I appreciate that. And I'm going to share my screen. I went ahead and put together a PowerPoint. So we have a big task set for ourselves today to talk about immigration policy in 25 minutes, right? Such a complex and controversial topic. So I will do my best to lay out a general framework, and this is how I'm going to proceed. I'm also happy to share this PowerPoint with anyone because it has resources and things on it. But immigration policy is very complex because it's made at all levels of our federal system. So it's made at the national level, at the state level, and at the local level, and there are different influences on policy at all those levels. It's also very controversial. I think anyone who's been a sentient human being in the past 5 years knows that, right? It's a very controversial area of policy. So we're going to look a little bit about why it's such a controversial area of policy. And then I want to talk to you about the actual character of U.S. immigration policy so that you can make better informed decisions about what you think U.S. immigration policy should be and vote for candidates who agree with you in that regard. So I'm going to start looking at this sort of overall conception of immigration in the United States. It's common to refer for us to refer to ourselves as a nation of immigrants, right? As the United States as being a nation of immigrants, and this goes way back. There's the iconic picture of Ellis Island there, but even more recently, this discourse of a nation of immigrants is steeped into our history. Although relatively recently, the term comes from the early 1960s from John F. Kennedy, actually. And indeed, the United States has more immigrants than any other country in the world. About 1 in 5 of international migrants lives in the United States. And the US-Mexico corridor is the world's largest and busiest migration corridor. If you look at the numbers as a share of total population, it's somewhat lower. The US is about 14% foreign-born, 14% immigrant. Those two terms are interchangeable. Canada, by contrast, has 22% foreign-born, Australia 28%, and if you go to some of the smaller Gulf countries, UAE and Qatar, you're looking at upwards of 75, 88% of the population being foreign-born. But we're not always welcoming to immigration, and our fears about immigration run deep. We have fears about the effects of immigration on jobs and employment. We have fears about the effects of immigration on national security. We have fears about immigration and its effects on the culture of our nation. So I would say we have a very sort of, there's a lot of tension in our conception of ourselves as a country and our relationship to immigration. This anti-immigrant sentiment is not something new in our history, and it tends to increase after periods of increase in immigration. So this is a chart from the Migration Policy Institute. The blue line is the number of immigrants in the United States over time, starting back before 1860 to the current period. The orange line is the percentage of foreign-born, or the number of foreign-born as a percent of the total population. So the three arrows that I have on here represent periods of anti-immigrant sentiment, and they all follow periods of increases in immigration. So the first one in the 1850s was the Know Nothing Party, the emergence of the Know Nothing Party, which was an anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic party. In response to increases in immigration, which continued really up until 1920. In the 1920s, we had a period of very restrictive immigration policy. We put national origin quotas on and restricted immigration policy significantly, and then you see that orange line decrease. So we saw a major decrease in immigration during that period. After 1965, which I'm going to talk about a law in 1965, we've seen a major increase in immigration. And we saw what you might term anti-immigrant or bills that are concerned about immigration emerging in the mid-1990s, actually in the Clinton administration, and then continuing after that. Americans' preferences for immigration, though, don't always follow the politics of them. They tend to be more, Americans tend to be more positive than your politics would lead you to believe. In fact, this year, for the first time since Gallup has been asking, or the first time since 1965, Gallup found that the majority of Americans favor increasing immigration versus decreasing. So that's that dark green line at the bottom, 34%. Favor increasing immigration, 28% favor decreasing immigration, and then the lighter green line in the middle is keep it at the present level, right, which is 36%. So Americans are overwhelmingly favorable toward immigration. It's best to think about immigration, I think, in general as two sides of the same coin. This is and the coin I would call like a national interest coin, right? So immigration is all about, as are all policies, right, about promoting the national interest of the United States. And so we think about immigration and its role in promoting our national interest, both in terms of facilitating immigration. How can immigration policy make our country better, right? How can immigration policy protect and facilitate, improve, right, our country. So when we think about facilitating immigration, some of the key ideas have been to family reunification. That's what was one of the major impetuses behind the 1965 law, contributing to our labor market, contributing to our economy, being a country that provides humanitarian assistance to foreign nationals who need it, and also being a diverse country. And these are all themes that have pushed us toward facilitating immigration over time. But restricting immigration is the other side of that coin. We have concerns, legitimate concerns about immigration. So we're always wondering what is the best way to keep people out whose presence we feel not to be in the national interest. So we have national security concerns, most recently concerns about terrorism. We have economic concerns. Do immigrants take jobs away from U.S. workers? And we also have concerns about integration, right? Some people would call it assimilation, right? How can our country integrate people who have different cultural backgrounds, different languages? So I want to talk a little bit about the laws that guide immigration, and the most important one of those laws, well, first, this is an important distinction. So we have permanent and we have temporary migration, and I'm going to focus mostly on permanent migration. We have people who come temporarily to the United States. They're actually called non-immigrant. They come on non-immigrant visas. They might come for school or to visit Disney World, right, the most visited place in the world, or on temporary work visas. But none of those types of immigration or visas lead to legal permanent residence, or not automatically to legal permanent residence, or the potential for naturalization. So we're going to focus mostly on permanent immigration, so immigration that leads to the ability of someone to stay in the United States permanently and potentially, and to naturalize, to become a US citizen. So the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act is the most important piece of immigration legislation that really structures the system that we have right now. And some important things to know about that 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act is, number one, that it increased the number of immigrants significantly in this country. So if you remember that orange line that went down, trended down pretty severely after the national origin quotas in the 1920s, then you see here, well, you can see it here as well, right? You see immigration increasing significantly after the passage of the 1965 law, because we got rid of those national origin quotas and we opened up our immigration system significantly, and that led to a big increase over time in the number of foreign-born people in the United States. It also changed significantly where those people came from. So in 1960, before the passage of this law, the top 3 origin countries, countries of birth for immigrants to the United States, were Italy, Germany, and Canada. In 2013, the top 3 countries are Mexico, China, and India. Those are still the top 3 countries, though for new migrants, China and India are the top 2. So that the 65 Act changed significantly in terms of who was here as a foreign-born or as an immigrant to the United States. It also established generally who was allowed to come as an immigrant, who was allowed to come, apply for and get a visa and come for legal permanent residence. And this is a somewhat updated version of this on the right, but right now this is about the breakdown that we have in terms of the visas that we give out for legal permanent residence. And as you can see on the right half of this chart on this side, about 66%, about 2/3 of those visas are family-based migration. So we give visas to family members of US citizens, natural born or naturalized, to bring them here to this country for family reunification. That was a major push of the 1965 Act. Something more recent is visas for refugees and asylees. That's about 13%. That would be a humanitarian reason to give a visa. And then about 14% of our visas are for employment. So we give visas for people to come here permanently because our labor market needs them. They're sponsored by employers, and they're brought here permanently. We also have a diversity lottery, which I will talk to you about in just a second. So more recent pieces of legislation, the 1980 Refugee Act was important because it codified into US law a process by which refugees could come into the United States. And you can see on the left are the annual ceilings and then the number that the president sets every year for the number of refugees and the number who've been brought in. Importantly, right after the act was passed, the United States, brought in almost 240,000 refugees, most of them from Vietnam at the time. We also in 1990 created what's called a diversity lottery. Congress felt at the time that because of the restrictions on immigration to mostly family-based or employment, that it left entire swaths of the world out, people who had no legal way to come to the United States, and we wanted to diversify that. So they created this diversity lottery, which yields 50,000 visas a year, and it's literally a lottery. People apply for it around the world, and every year the State Department polls, right, electronically 50,000 applications to give people a visa to come here permanently. And as you can see for this chart here on the left, this is a very popular program around the world. In 2017, there were 22.4 million people who applied for those 50,000 visas to come here to the United States. It's also true, and this is something that we hear quite a lot about, is illegal or unauthorized immigration. And one of the things these laws did is to make regular the process for who could come to the United States, and it meant that there are many people who don't fit those categories, who don't have a way to come to the United States legally, or the only way they have is a 10, 20-year wait in line for visas. So you had in the 1990s in particular an increase in unauthorized or illegal immigration, and we have now in the United States about a quarter of our foreign-born population is unauthorized, is here without legal status. That number has declined in recent years since the mid-2000s, but it's stabilized now at about 10.5, 10.7 million people here in the United States. One thing that's important to point out about the people who are here in the United States illegally or without authorization is that in this bottom right corner of the slide, 2/3 of them have been here more than 10 years. So what does it mean to be here more than 10 years? You have a job, you probably have US citizen children. In fact, half of all undocumented immigrants have US citizen children. You may own property, you may own a business, you have ties into the community. So it becomes a more complex problem for policymakers. We also have some temporary or what are called twilight statuses. That's because they don't lead to legal permanent residence. They don't lead to a path to citizenship automatically. They are sort of these statuses that sit out there waiting for presidential action to change them. The probably one that you know something about is DACA, or Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, but 800,000 young people who President Obama in 2012 provided what is essentially a stay of deportation, essentially saying as an executive, I'm not going to deport this group of young people who came to the United States as children, brought here by their parents. Temporary protected status was part of that 1990 immigration law, and that provides temporary status to people who are here when something goes wrong in their home country. So if you're a Salvadoran and you were a Honduran and you were here during Hurricane Mitch, and it was very difficult to go back to Honduras, and the president could give you temporary protected status. Temporary protected status tends to be reauthorized consistently by presidents, so many people with TPS have been in the country 25, 30 years. So that's kind of the facilitating immigration side of it. We have made a choice as a country to focus on family-based migration, to a much lesser extent, humanitarian employment and diversity paths to immigration. The other side of that coin is restricting immigration. And of course, we have interior and exterior enforcement. On the exterior, we want to have borders, land borders and other borders, airports and ports that are protected against people coming in without us knowing it, right? Without us checking that they have a legal basis to be here and who they are. And we also have interior enforcement, and that's where we go after people who are here without legal status. So people who are here illegally, maybe people who have criminal records, and deport them out of the country. So how is immigration policy made? And I'm going to slip quickly through this because I want to get to the different policy positions. But it's really important, and I said this at the beginning, this is your basic US government 101, but it's really important to think about the ways in which at the federal level, the three branches of government interact on policy. So Congress obviously has the responsibility to pass laws, but in doing so, Congress tends to give the executive a lot of authority in terms of immigration policy. So if you look here, Congress gives the president the authority to set the ceilings for refugee admissions. So every year it's the president who decides how many refugees we will allow into the country. Congress gives the president the power to grant temporary protected status and to take temporary protected status away from migrants who are here. And importantly, presidents control immigration enforcement. Immigration enforcement is part of the executive branch. ICE, who you've probably heard of, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, is part of Customs Enforcement is part of the Department of Homeland Security, and presidents control that department and they decide who they want to prioritize for enforcement. Enforcement dollars are not limitless, so we have to actually focus on certain segments of the undocumented population for removal, for targeting for removal. It's also important that these policies are shared on a federal level between federal, state, and local levels. So you may have heard of 287G, which is a federal policy that was actually in the 1996 law, but it's the federal government wanting to partner with local law enforcement on immigration enforcement. This is completely optional, voluntary on the part of local law enforcement. Sometimes states get involved and say you must or you must not cooperate with federal law enforcement. I had the sheriff of Mecklenburg County on with my class yesterday, and he talked about his mandate from the North Carolina legislature to cooperate with federal law enforcement, even though he has rescinded 287G. So some questions to consider when you think about immigration policy. Number one is, how many legal permanent immigrants should we accept every year, right? We have accepted, well, net migration to the United States has been about 1 million people a year for the past several, well, prior to the Trump administration, was averaging about 1 million people a year. Is that the right number, or should it be fewer? Should it be more? What types of immigrants? Which categories should have preference? Should it be family-based migration, or should we focus more on employment-based migration? Should we expand our humanitarian programs, refuge and asylum? What should we do with people who are here without legal status, that 1 in 4 foreign-born who are here without a legal status to be here in the country? What about those Twilight Statuses, DACA and temporary protected status? What level and type of immigration is good for the U.S. economy? We talk a lot about the economic effects of immigration and what is the best way, what contributes best to the U.S. economy and to U.S. workers. What's the best way to protect our borders, our national security? What's the best way to keep us safe? In the case of the US-Mexico border, how do we facilitate legal traffic? There's about $4 billion of goods that go back and forth across the US-Mexico border every single day. About 1 million people go legally almost every single day across that border. We want to maintain that legal commerce. We want to restrict illegal commerce, of course. And cost effectiveness. Border security is all immigration enforcement is expensive. Right now we spend more at the federal level on immigration enforcement than all other types of legal enforcement at the federal level put together. What is our responsibility to people who are fleeing persecution in their home countries? How humanitarian should we be as a nation? And finally, what's the best way to integrate immigrants into our society and political system? So if we start with, I want to look at the presidential candidates a little bit here, and I hope you will go back and look at Senate and other candidates later. But if you just look at, these are just screenshots of their web pages on immigration. So on that, there's general questions of who are we as a country and what we should be focusing on. You see a real contrast between these two candidates. Joe Biden actually uses that phrase, a nation of immigrants, in his policy platform. He wants to secure our values and as a nation of immigrants to return to that. A lot of what he talks about is returning to the way immigration policy was before the Trump administration. The Trump administration is more focused on illegal immigration and protecting American workers. So they're much more focused on immigration enforcement, getting rid of people who are here illegally, and restricting immigration, and particularly restricting immigration in ways that protect American workers, or the ways that they see protecting American workers. So on legal immigration, on this question of facilitating immigration, what should we do to facilitate immigration, you can see a contrast here that's pretty stark between the two presidential candidates. For Vice President Biden, he wants to return again to the levels of legal migration we had prior to the Trump administration. The Trump administration has done a lot to restrict legal immigration. They've passed over 400 different executive orders and actions that have affected legal and undocumented immigration. So President Trump wants to continue to reduce legal immigration, which has fallen by almost 1/2 under his presidency. Vice President Biden doesn't talk specifically about how he would see that relationship between family-based employment, humanitarian migration, but he says he wants to modernize the immigration system, which is typically taken to mean more employment-based visas. But again, that's something that he hasn't been particularly clear about. For President Trump, he's more interested, he wants to reduce family migration, which he often calls chain migration, right? That family members bring other family members in, and he wants to shift our focus more to economic-based migration. Certain kinds, not other kinds, but definitely focusing more on the economy. Vice President Biden wants to restore access to public benefits. These were cuts, there's a bunch of laws in 1996 that affected this, and also a public charge rule that was promulgated under the Trump administration. So Vice President Biden wants to open those up, and President Trump wants to further restrict them. In terms of refugees, humanitarian migration, Vice President Biden has said he wants to increase refugee admissions to 125,000 a year, which is back what it was at the end of the Obama administration. But President Trump, his most recent ceiling was 18,000, so that's a big difference. That last point about Venezuelans is really interesting. So Vice President Biden is talking about temporary protected status for Venezuelans. Venezuelans don't have TPS right now, but there are a lot of reasons why Venezuelans can't go back to their country. And so Vice President Biden has been pushing this idea of TPS for Venezuelans. To date, President Trump hasn't, which is sort of interesting because Florida is such an important swing state, and I would think that that President Trump would want to promise TPS for Venezuelans to help his electoral prospects there, but to date he hasn't. On illegal immigration, there's also a very strong contrast. President Trump, in terms of those priorities for enforcement, he got rid of any of the priorities that the Obama administration had, and so essentially anyone that ICE encounters who is not here legally is subject to deportation. They don't have to have a criminal record other than the immigration infringements. And he wants to continue to do that. Vice President Biden says he'll put a moratorium on deportations, and when he reopens deportations, he will focus on those with felony convictions. President Biden wants to stop building the wall, do more technological barriers at the border. President Trump wants more resources to continue to build the wall. Vice President Biden wants a path to citizenship for the 11 plus million who are here undocumented, and to keep DACA, which would be part of that path to citizenship. President Trump doesn't favor a path to citizenship, and he's been trying to rescind DACA for a while. In terms of their relationship with Central America, Vice President Biden wants to give a lot of foreign aid to Central America. This is something that the Obama administration did. They also opened this Central American Minors Program where Central American children could actually apply for asylum in their country of origin, not come up to the US border. President Trump got rid of that and has done other things to shut down migration from Central America. And that's it. Look, I think I did it. Almost. And these are some resources that I'm happy to share with you. Resources just on immigration policy in general, and then some resources on the candidates' platforms. So I'll stop sharing, and I'm happy to take any questions.
So we do have one question, and this person asked, how does immigration relate to the demographic situation in the United States, specifically the declining birth rate and the graying of the population?
Yeah, so one of the, for those who think that we should have a robust, a high level of immigration, one of the major arguments that they put forward for this is that we do have an aging population, right? We have a declining birth rate, so we have fewer young people coming in, we have more people into retirement age, and immigration helps keep our population young. If you look at some of the sectors in which immigrants are very heavily employed in, it would be elderly care, right? Also nursing and those types of sectors. So for a lot of people, it makes sense economically to have a robust high level of immigration to help replace income. It's also true that when you look at the effect of immigration on the growth of the economy, the size of the economy, I mean, one of the major things that contributes to the size of our gross domestic product is the number of people who are working. If you have more people who are working, you have a higher gross domestic product, right? So more people means higher GDP. So more immigration means higher GDP.
Thank you. And we are kind of right at the end of our time, but if you do have more questions, feel free to reach out to Jen or myself, and we can put you in touch with Dr. Commons, and I'm sure that she would be more than happy to share her PowerPoint with her or with you all, and also to answer any questions that you might have. So thank you all for joining us today, and a special thank you to Dr. Commons for sharing your insights and your knowledge with us. And join us next week for our final Lunch and Learn series. And this will be done by Dr. Hauk, who will be speaking about what is happening with our vote on Election Day, and what if the new president can't be announced, and where we go from there. So this was a highly requested series, and so we are going to finish it out with Dr. Hauk. So thank you all so much for joining us today. Have a wonderful rest of your week, and do not forget to go vote.
Thanks, Emily.
Thank you, Dr. Commons.